Okay, so we're here at Biologists at 100 with Richard Sever. You gave the keynote presentation in the early career session, which was great. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
And we're going to ask you a few more questions now about what you're doing with the preprint world, if that's okay.
Okay, sure. Go ahead. Fire away.
So you recently launched openRxiv. And I was curious if you could give us a summary of what this means for bioRxiv and medRxiv and why you've done this.
Well, I think what it really means is that it's a kind of recognition that the projects have matured.
Yeah.
In some ways, in 2013 when we started bioRxiv, it was an experiment.
Yeah.
When we started medRxiv in 2019, it was an experiment, and certainly with bioRxiv, I think the research community have voted with their feet and said, we think this is an experiment that is succeeding.
Yeah.
We now have, I think, something like 1/3 papers across all of them. With medRxiv, there was this kind of crazy thing where we launched it in 2019 and then came 2020 and the pandemic. But that was, was, I think, as good an example of why it was a good thing to have done, because suddenly you had, many scientists saying they couldn't imagine how their research could have sort of persisted in the same way during the pandemic without medRxiv. Things moved faster, and you had Tony Fauci and the head of WHO and people like that saying preprints are a thing. So we get to 2025. It's like, okay, bioRxiv is 12 years old. It's sort of embedded, this experiment embedded in an academic institution, and now I think the community as a whole feel that it's essentially a sort of critical piece of infrastructure.
Yeah.
And when you think of it like that, then you think of, right, okay, how should this be organized? Having it just as in the back room of a research institution probably doesn't make sense. So we've created this new organization called openRxiv, which is not a preprint server. That's the main thing. It's not a preprint server. It's basically a non-profit organization. This is going to run bioRxiv and medRxiv. And ensure their long-term stability, because they're now like proven resources that the scientific community depend on. And so we're hiring new staff. We're going to be hiring a CEO and various other positions to really create this organization that can say how can we make these things sustainable in the long term and serve the community in the long term.
Cool. So I guess kind of, if it's become such an integral part of the community, what do you think some of the major challenges were in getting you to being such an integral part? What were the biggest challenges?
I think fear was one of the major challenges, and we worked quite hard. Fear among authors that this is a dangerous step that they were taking. They were taking a risk. Authors were taking a risk. If I put my paper on bioRxiv, something bad going to happen. People, might I get scooped? And that kind of question came up over and over again. But what was kind of interesting, and I had this conversation so many times, was I would talk to scientists about that, and they'd be wary at first. Then you'd explain how it worked, and that actually, if you put your paper out on bioRxiv, you've got a date stamp, you've put a marker in the ground, and there'd be this arc where they would go from fear and kind of wariness to, well, yeah, obviously, why don't we do this? And of course, this wasn't an original idea. The physicists had done it beforehand, and that's what their response to all these kind of fears were like, why would you fear scooping if what you're doing is using an anti-scooping device?
Yeah.
So, it took a bit of sort of discussion and a learning curve. But I think what was kind of interesting was there was many scientists that I spoke to who would say things like, well, I'm a bit wary at first. Then I did it, and nothing bad happened. Everybody read my paper much sooner. I got it was a really positive experience. And then they'd say, well, I now do it for all my papers.
Yeah.
And you see this with as different communities began to adopt it, and authors en masse would do it. That's exactly people didn't go back. Once they'd done it, they kept doing it.
Yeah.
So I think that was a fear. I mean, also when we launched bioRxiv, there was still a few journals that were, how should we say, not overly enthusiastic about the idea. But again, that's changed radically. I mean, there's an interesting Wikipedia page that you look at with journal policies, and it's like it's red if they don't like preprints, it's grey if they're kind of not sure, and it's green if they're fine.
Yeah.
And if you go back to 2013, there was a lot of red on that page.
Yeah.
Now, totally green.
Okay.
There's no journal there's no real journal that has any issue of
They're
this
going to lose
at all.
good work if they haven't.
Well, exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. I mean, if you were, there was a point when Cell weren't too keen, but Nature and Science were like, it's fine. So, how are you going to compete with those journals if the authors want to post preprints?
It's the moving with your feet thing again.
yeah, exactly.
So with the very large impact it's had, I wonder, could you focus in and say something more about the impact it's had for early career researchers? How do you think preprints have affected them in particular?
I think hugely. I mean, I think the early career researchers for us have been an incredibly sort of active and vocal group of advocates. I think because they immediately see the benefits of it, and they realize their benefit. When I give talks, it's like almost without fail, if I give a talk at an institute, somebody or 2 or 3 people will come up to me afterwards and they'll say, this made such a huge difference to me because I put my paper on bioRxiv, then these people gave me a job, they gave me a tenure track position, and I'm here, and my paper's only just come out last month in Cell or whatever. So that you had all these people who just, rather than treading water for like a year or two, waiting for the paper, waiting for that evidence of productivity, they could do it right away. They were in control of the dissemination, and and to their credit, institutions were like, yeah, we can read the papers, we can decide if these people are any good, and they've done it. And you see that you see that for early career researchers at Rockefeller, and you see it for Howard Hughes Medical Institute doing their investigator renewals. So I think everybody realized this, and I think that's quite interesting because it really does demonstrate this thing that people had always said is you can decide if a paper's any good, you can decide by reading it.
Peer review is not necessarily
or the badge of the journal. So it was a pretty good demonstration that happened.
Okay. I had just one more question for you then, which is kind of looking forward to the future. How do you think preprints may change or may impact the biological community moving forward in a different way to maybe how it's already done, or do you think it will remain the same?
I think there will. I mean, one of my real hopes is that we always said that like the decoupling of the dissemination from the evaluation just basically created this evolutionary space. And so I think the weird thing we have with the current peer review is that whatever you work on, wherever you work, whatever level it is, the peer review process is basically the same. You send it to 3 people, you get some opinions, and you hope you get a decision back within 35.5 days or whatever it is. But once you decouple the peer review process with preprints, then you can really think, okay, what is it that I'm trying to do here? And the first thing will be, well, maybe what I'm trying to do is different depending on the paper. And so there's space to say, we'll do peer review differently depending on the field, depending on the paper. Maybe we don't have to kind of like really rush to have it done in this time. Maybe it can be more continuous. Maybe we can fragment it out. I mean, one of the things that I find slightly frustrating about the narrative about peer review in the journal world is that a lot of the time people don't realize that there's lots of stuff that journals do to evaluate work which is not done by the peer reviewers. Things like looking for image manipulation, checking stats, and lots of things. And so you realize that what we think of as peer review could be a lot more variable, possibly could be done better and in different ways, and perhaps doesn't need to be done at a single point in time. So that what I'm really looking forward to is, now that preprints have become such a sort of central part of the workflow for so many academics, whether all the sort of things that we talk about that might happen, that could happen, will happen. And we've begun to see some of those types of things. I mean, Company of Biologists, you have preLights, there's things like review commons. So you're getting this decoupled peer review process. You're getting different variations on news and views, for want of a better word. So I just want to see more of that, and it's great to see people experimenting like COB.
With the preLights and review commons, what do you think is going to be the next one then? Over all those things, what do you think is next?
Well, it's hard to say. I mean, I try not to be too much of a futurist, because I've heard so many futurists and they always seem to be so damn wrong.
Then you're going to look back on this in the future and you go, I was wrong.
Yeah, exactly. But I mean, one thing, for example, is there's a lot of conversations about data. We just heard a talk from Catherine Brown, and people issues with the data. Are the data in the paper, are they real, etc. And I think it would be interesting to see different ways in which data can be evaluated, data provenance could be demonstrated. And again, because of the decoupling of the dissemination from the evaluation, there's some flexibility that doesn't have to happen at the same time.
Yeah.
So I would like to see, I mean, people have always talked about the future of the scientific article, and my sort of shtick is always that I often think people think of it as like a bucket, and actually they should think of it as more like a constellation of objects. So you have a paper, but that's just a narrative about some data that are in a different place, and that may be validated in some way, and that maybe links a bunch of replications, and there may be, you may be able to rewind back and find that all the experiments were pre-registered, and you have this constellation of objects, and I think that's something that I think hopefully preprints can enable us into getting to that point.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Cool. Well, thank you very much for coming for just a nice brief interview. I hope you enjoy the rest of the Biologists at 100 conference.
Yeah,
and,
I'm sure I will.
The openRxiv is a huge success going forward.
Thank you very much.